2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds. My name is Salah Hassan. I'm a member of the Embassy Cultural House. I'm also a professor at Michigan State University. I direct the Global Studies in the Arts and Humanities program. And it's really my pleasure to be here. I'm from London. I grew up in London and spent, a lot of time back here in London since I left, and know a lot of people here. So it's really an honor to do this. I want to thank Josh for inviting me to do this, and the Embassy Cultural House for helping to bring Omar El Akkad to London. And we had the opportunity to have him at Michigan State on Thursday evening give a talk. So it's really been great. I also want to thank the museum for hosting the event and sponsoring it, and all the other contributors and people who have made this possible. So I'm going to start. We're going to have this conversation. I've been spending a lot of time with Omar over the last few days. We crossed the border together, 2 Arab guys, one with an expired green card.
He didn't tell me until we were pulling up to the customs thing. He's like, by the way, my citizenships or my green card's expired. It's not okay. I needed to know that like 20 miles earlier. That was.
They held us for a while. How long did they hold us? They held us for a little while.
Like 30 seconds. Well, you tried to explain to him that I was the Giller Prize winning author, and he looked at you like you were from outer space.
Like, you don't know the Giller? Come on. So it took a little while, and finally, he actually did hold us for more than 30 seconds. I mean, I was like, he's gonna like pull us over. It was like, what are you doing here? Why are you, why are you going to London?
It wasn't great.
No, it wasn't nice. It was uncomfortable. It was strange. I wonder why. So, do you want to talk a little bit about what you're doing now, where you're from, like where you're living right now, and sort of, what you're working on?
Sure, yeah. So we moved to Portland, Oregon on the West Coast about 9 years ago, which actually makes it the longest I've lived almost anywhere. We were in Toronto. My wife was doing a postdoc at U of T. And first year out, she applied only for Canadian academic positions, got no offers. The next year out, she applied for everywhere, got 4 offers, and they were all in the US. And of those 4 places, Portland was by far the most livable. I got nothing against Waco, Texas, but I didn't want to be the...
I do. I lived in Texas. I did my PhD in Austin. Waco is, No.
The weird thing is that after they offered her the job, they fly her back for the pitch meeting, right? And at the pitch meeting, they're like, so had you heard of Waco before? And she's like, yes. And they're like, oh, because George W. Bush lives here. It's like, nope, that's not. They're trying to get over that whole unpleasantness.
Branch Davidians.
Yeah, the whole thing about that. That's not a. There's no signs or anything commemorating that. That's not a.
Correct.
Yeah, they were very nice, but we were not going to Waco. And so we ended up in Portland. So that's where I live. We live just south of Portland in the woods. We think we live across the street from Damian Lillard, the point guard of the Portland Trailblazers, but I've never seen anybody go into that mansion. I'm not going to trespass to find out. None of this is relevant to why we're here, but anyway. So we live there, and right now I'm working on what I hope will be the next novel, but it's sort of like it's 5 chapters in, and none of it works. So I'm gonna be cagey about that for now.
So in the conversations we've had, you were telling me about some research you were doing on sand, scarcity. Sand and things that might go away soon and we'll have to live without. Can you talk a little bit about how you direct your attention to new subjects like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things, right, where it's not like I've been an incredibly successful writer, but I've had a little bit of success, and one of the things that happens is that your reward for having a little bit of success as a writer is less and less writing time. Like there's a bunch of stuff that I wanted to do and just couldn't. I signed on to do this thing a while back, this podcast about just things that we will have to do without one day. So one of the episodes is about sand, because we use sand more than anything other than water, more than any other natural resource. We use it in concrete, and there's all these cities that are coming up overnight in China, and all that concrete uses sand, and there's so much of it. The price of sand has quintupled. There's sand mafias, like actual sort of illicit gangs, and people have been killed over this stuff. So I found that really fascinating and sort of chased it down. What I would do in a vacuum is just sit alone at home and write fiction. But also I have bills to pay, and I never got out of the broke author mode. where I just say yes to everything, partially because I'm flattered that anybody would ask me to do anything, but also because it's like, oh, you're going to pay me like $50 to write this essay? That's amazing. And then you sort of, wait, I spent 3 weeks on this? This is not cost effective. And so weirdly enough, I just made a lot of bad decisions where like I said yes to things that I shouldn't have, and I said no to things that I really wanted to do. And now I'm sort of living with the consequences of that.
Can you talk a little bit about American War and kind of what's happening with that book? Last night in East Lansing on Thursday night, you talked about how it's an Arab novel, but people are reading it as an American novel because of what happened after 2016. So can you talk a little bit about how it's an Arab novel, like why you think of it as an Arab novel, and what, like, kind of walk us through a little bit some of the allegorical maybe aspects of the novel?
Sure, yeah. I mean, so the story I go back to all the time about how this book started was a long time ago in the early days of the NATO invasion. I was watching this I don't know if it was on CNN or one of the other news networks, but this interview was with a foreign affairs expert, one of these talking heads they bring in every now and then. And a few days earlier, there had been these widespread protests in Afghanistan, local villagers protesting against the U.S. military presence. And the question that was put to this gentleman was, why do they hate us so much? And as part of his answer, he noted that sometimes the special forces have to go into these villages and conduct nighttime raids looking for insurgents, and that when they do this, they'll sometimes ransack the houses or hold women and children at gunpoint. And then he very helpfully added, and you know, in Afghan culture, that sort of thing is considered very offensive. I thought, like, name me one culture on earth that wouldn't consider, so the thinking behind American War was to take the hallmarks of these conflicts that have defined the world in my life, so the last 40 years, and these are conflicts in which U.S. involvement has either been indirect or sort of from a very great distance, and to cast them as close to home as I could think of. And I couldn't think of anything closer to home than a civil war where you're fighting yourself. But the point was to take this trope that's headed in the other direction so often we don't think about it anymore and kind of flip it around. And so I go back to this thing about, like, if you watch a James Bond movie or a Jason Bourne movie, there's always like a scene on a Caribbean island or a car chase through a Moroccan bazaar, and it's fully understood that the place doesn't matter narratively. It's a table, and the tablecloth being laid on top of it is somebody else's story, and I wanted to flip that around. And I wanted to make the most powerful empire in the world the table, and I wanted to lay another people's story on top of it. And I often say that if I'd written this book 100 years earlier, I would have had to call it British War. It's not, the point was not the U.S. in of itself, the point was the empire. And so I thought, this isn't a particularly clever trick that I'm describing here, right? It's just inversion. And then the book ends up coming out in April of 2017 and sells a ton more copies because it's considered like a Trump book, and it shows up on all these lists of like the first books of the Trump era and the books you need to read to understand this moment, and has been read as an exclusively American book. But like so much of what's in here is not that. We were talking about this the other day. There's a scene, there's a part, the middle of the book takes place in this thing called Camp Patience, right? And the things that happen in Camp Patience, particularly the things at the end of that section, are very much based on what happened in Sabra and Shatia, which is a refugee camp that was the site of a massacre about 40 years ago. Sabr is the Arabic word for patience. That's where the name comes from, so on and so forth. And when I do book clubs in this part of the world, one of the questions I get most often is like, why is that section so brutal? And then I did a book club, a virtual book club with an Egyptian book group who immediately got the reference. And one of the first questions was, well, if this is based on Sabra and Shatia, why did you tone it down so much? It's all the prism, right? Like, it's not, the book is almost secondary. It's how you read it. But I think of it as a deeply Arab book, and hardly anybody else does.
So, like, when you talk about empire in the book, it's the Bouazizi Empire. When you kind of conceptualize that, because we don't get a sense of how it comes about, how it arises out of the ashes that are the Middle East today. This is 50 years later, 70 years later, something like that, right? So when do you sort of have a fantasy of how, like, the Arab world comes together in a kind of future? Like, does it reflect something? Like, do you imagine, okay, well, first this is going to happen, like Syria and Iraq, and like the Mashreq are going to unify, and then they're going to be able to assert themselves to take over the resources of the Gulf or something like that? I don't know.
I'll take whatever the hell I can get. I mean, if there's a unified Arab anything, I would be thrilled. No, I mean, again, it's this other inversion, right, where I took the creation story of the United States and kind of superimposed it, whereas sort of people rise up against perceived tyranny, and after a series of failures, they sort of come about. Geographically in the book, like a big part of the Middle East is now just these sun farms, right? It's just like Saudi Arabia is just solar panels, essentially. It's too hot to live in most of these places, and a lot of that is just research papers that I extrapolated and sort of deliberately misinterpreted, kind of thing. But the thought of it was, again, I'm a one-trick pony, right? It was this inversion. So in the book, for example, there's it's interspersed between the chapters are these fake historical documents, letters from governors and oral histories and whatnot. And there's one that was a speech from the head of the Bouazizi Empire given in the United States at a time when the United States is clearly fracturing and having a real hard go of things. And the first draft of that, my editors had to get me to change it because it was just Obama's Cairo speech with like the locations changed. And they were like, no, you can't just do this. This is just plagiarism at this point. But I was like, but you don't understand. There's the thing with this. And they're like, we understand. It's fine, but you can't do that. But a lot of it is that, right? Is this notion of, at some point in this book, somebody says that the universal motto of war is, if it were you, you would have done no different. And so a lot of it was just flipping that script. Unfortunately, one half of that script is really not part of the popular consciousness in this part of the world. And so it doesn't look like you're flipping a script. Mm-hmm. It looks like you're turning up a dial. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the reviews were like, oh, really? Is this how a second civil war would go down? What about this? What about that? And I was like,
or if we don't do something, the Arabs are going to take over. Right?
Yeah, I mean, we
got to keep an eye on those people over there because they'll become too powerful.
There's a weird cult that has read this book as an operating manual. Like I remember getting a blurb back from a bookseller in Texas who was like, American War shows why a second civil war would be bloody and brutal and why it is necessary. And I was like, oh, you thought this was a pro-war book? That's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, once it gets away from you, and especially something like this, which I should have seen coming when you throw the word American in the title and you set it in this fake alternate United States, and first thing you see is a map with like the capital moved to Columbus and all of this stuff. Like, I can't be that surprised that this happened. But I'm still kind of surprised because I didn't think it was like that clever a trick going into it.
Yeah. It's like a pretty complex novel. And I know I've talked to a lot of people about it.
There's a lot of stuff happening. Yeah, I don't know if it's complex.
Yeah, it's pretty complex. So let me shift to one of the complexities of it, which is the central character, Sarat, woman of color. It's interesting for me to think about these like white Proud Boys identifying with Sarat as a hero of a right-wing resistance. She's a woman of color. She's a lesbian. She's iconoclastic in every way. I mean, she's breaking things and breaking rules and crossing lines. And can you talk a little bit about how you come up with that particular character? Like, what goes into it? Like, mom is African American, dad's Mexican, right? The dad dies early, and so she's kind of not quite an orphan, but because of the refugee status, they sort of seem like they're orphans. And then the mom dies in the camp. So can you talk a little bit about what goes into creating a character like Sarat? And even like her name, which is not really her name, because her name is Sarah T, right? And it becomes Sarat.
Sarah T. Chestnut. She's named after a couple of Civil War figures, a famous diarist, and I think the only woman indicted in the plot to kill Lincoln, where the names come from.
The Sarah.
Yeah. It was just sort of so the Sarah T thing is what's his name? One of the presidents who had an initial attached to his name for no discernible reason, and he was too polite to do anything about it, so it stuck. But it'll come to me in a second. Sorry, it's been 10 years since I started writing this book. Mary Chestnut and Mary Surratt. So Surratt Chestnut comes from the two Marys. Yeah, I mean, I wanted the central arc of the book to be. So this was written at a time when I mean, this is still sort of the case today, but when we talk about radicalization, we usually talk about the finish line. Somebody does something awful, and we start and end with that thing, as though there were no sort of previous lead up to that.
Like a suicide operation.
Yeah, like
something.
any sort of really violent act is sort of constrained within itself. And I wanted the rest of the race leading up to the finish line. And I wanted this character who is, her circle of trust at the beginning of the novel is infinite. She believes everything everyone tells her about the world. And the more damage she's subjected to, the more that circle of trust closes in. You know, first it's just her family, and then just certain members of her family, and then one or two people, and then just herself. And by the very end, it's just her sense of revenge. That's the only thing she has any trust in. I'm not saying that that's how all human beings will respond to damage. A lot of people respond to damage with acts of love, but this isn't a book about that. This is a book about someone who is damaged and becomes damaging. And so that was the sort of narrative arc of the book. And I didn't want her to spend too much time justifying herself, any facet of herself, good or bad. And that's resulted in a lot of criticism of the book, of sort of why doesn't she talk about this? And that's a perfectly valid criticism, but it wasn't the thing I set out to do. I wanted this person to be who she was at any given moment in the book, good or bad. She showed up as an image. At one point, I had this image of a young girl pouring honey into the knots of the wood of her front porch. I don't know where the hell that came from, but it did. And once it did, it sort of stuck in my head. And that's essentially the opening image of the book. But once she showed up, the book started as a kind of manifesto, which is a really bad way to start a novel. You should not start with like a political thesis statement and try to wrap a novel around it. But it did start like that. I was angry at the way the world was, and I wanted to write about it. And as soon as she showed up, everything else sort of took a backseat. And of any character I've written in both the 2 published novels and the 3 thoroughly unpublishable novels that came before, of all those characters, the one that sticks most in my head is her. I don't like her, but I love her dearly, and she won't go away.
So
yeah.
I still want to get more specifically at the question of her racial, sexual, gendered identity in the novel. Can I push on that a little bit more?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so almost everything I write is about people who are unanchored in some way, because that's the life I've had. You know, I often say I've been a guest on someone else's land since I was 5 years old, and almost everything about me is a result of that. I had no say in the matter. This happened before I had any say in it. And so the reason I sound like this, for example, is a result of that, because my parents and my grandparents come from a particular generation that thinks of something like English as the winner's language. You know, these people colonized us. There must be some point in getting, if we can get our son to learn this language. And, the reason I wrote these books, all of that belongs to the same part and parcel thing that also makes me feel completely untethered all of the time. I was born in Egypt, but I left when I was 5. I grew up in Qatar. I could never have Qatari citizenship or ever consider myself Qatari. I came to Canada when I was 16, so Canada doesn't start for me before that. Now I live in the US, and every morning I wake up and realize that I don't know anything about that country, and everything I thought I understood about it is nonsense. And so the defining aspect of Surat in that respect, and the only thing she has in common with me, is this notion that she can't point to one set of experiences, one culture, and say, this is mine. Yes, she's half black, half Mexican, but the defining trait of those relationships with culture is that they live alone on basically an island in southern Louisiana. And so in the same way that I sort of didn't realize I was brown until I came to this part of the world, there's a sense of like, okay, what does this actually mean? If there's no lineage, if you are isolated from a root system, what does it mean to be these things? And that sort of relates to this idea that she doesn't spend too much time talking about this. Her sense of identity is experiential, which I think is the same for a lot of human beings, and the experiences are of this moment in history that she's caught up in, and that's what changes her as a human being. But again, like, you set the story in the South, in the US, and that comes with a particular sort of obligation and expectation. And the book doesn't meet that at all. And that's been the site of some criticism, and I think it's perfectly valid criticism. It's just that wasn't the book I was going to write.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but I mean, it's counterintuitive, right? You don't expect this young person who is Mexican, black, and lesbian to become the kind of iconic leader of the right-wing resistance in the Civil War. It's like, that's the issue, right? And like, I can kind of get it. I can make a reading of it, but I'm a literary critic. right? That's what I do. So I don't know what other people do with that. And so I'm like wondering like how, like I like it actually. Like I find it provocative in a lot of ways because it doesn't fit the codes of political correctness, right? It's like you're resisting like, oh, this is what everybody would expect somebody like this to do, is like be on the resistance on the good side, not on the bad side. But through her, we're sort of drawn into understanding the bad side. And so what that made me think, sorry, I'm gonna go for a second, is that if you flip the script, it's like, how do you understand that some young Arab guy or woman becomes a suicide bomber? It makes you try to understand that, especially like in a period of political Islam that seems very conservative and repressive and authoritarian. Like I don't identify with that. But then I try and understand how so Paradise Now, that was a film we were talking about, right, is sort of that story, because those guys aren't terrorists, I don't know if you guys all know the film Paradise Now, a Palestinian film about these two guys who decide because their lives are worthless to become suicide bombers. They're not religious fanatics or anything.
I mean, I think I wanted to construct a novel where it was impossible to side with any one character without assuming a level of moral debt. And that's a very difficult thing to wrap a sales job around. Because again, like Surat, by the end of this story, is a deeply evil human being.
Oh, yeah.
And so she's doing these things, you talk about this sort of right-wing resistance, she's doing these things that are clearly sort of seen as elements, as a proponent of that, I suppose, but she hates these people. She can't stand them and what they've allowed to happen to her. The book overwhelmingly for me is a critique of something like neoliberalism. So, the few times that the North is mentioned in this, they, for example, in this fake capital of Columbus, Ohio, there's sort of the inner circle of where the protected human beings are, and then the outer circle where all the attacks happen are manned by sort of displaced Southerners. That's very much just the stuff I saw in Afghanistan, where the NATO airfield was the outer wire. The inner wire was defended by NATO troops with state-of-the-art equipment and training, and the outer wire, where all the attacks actually happened, was the Afghanistani troops who are like 18 years old and have the weapons the Russians, the Soviets left behind. It was a critique of the neoliberal way of doing things, but the temptation to just have like one person that I can side with without feeling horrible about myself is so great. And I tried my best to resist that, and I think that's one of the reasons that Surat is a really difficult character, for better or worse, is that she's not that. And at the end, all I want you to do is try to understand how she got there. I don't want you to side with her. But we've just gone through the 9/11 age where it's like you're either with us or against us, you're with us or you're with the terrorists, and that binary is so ingrained into the public consciousness that it makes a book like this really difficult to sort of toss out there and not expect some kind of resistance.
Yeah, I'm going to switch to What Strange Paradise and ask you, so both books really are through the perspective of a child. They begin with a child, sort of a child's perspective, more or less, or children play a huge role in both books. Can you talk a little bit about the child in the novels? Like, I mean, they are the central characters. I mean, in Surat's case, she grows up a little bit, but she's still sort of that child. Like she morphs physically, but her personality sort of stays that child, that adventurous, daring, courageous child, right? So can you talk a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the first time I was asked about this, it hadn't occurred to me that I so often return to childhood, and I looked at a lot of my short stories, and lo and behold, same thing, right? I think I retreat into childhood because I think of it as sort of the time of our only honest interaction with the world, before all of the sort of compelling forces of adulthood and the lies you have to tell yourself to get through the day, and all of that kicks in. And because I tend to write about the things that make me angry, and those things are systemic and kind of dependent on an inherent fraudulence, I tend to collide them with what I think of as the fundamental honesty of childhood. In the case of What Strange Paradise, that was sort of the macro thinking behind it, but at the individual level, a lot of the stuff in terms of the interaction between the children in that novel is just stuff taken from my childhood. So I was talking about this the other day, this notion of like, because I grew up in a place like Qatar where 90% of the population is non-Qatari, they've all come there from somewhere else to sort of cash in on the oil and gas money. you're a kid on the beach one day, you see another kid, you want to make friends, you naturally assume they're not going to speak your language. And so you do the hand gesture stuff, or you kind of go into the interaction with a certain expectation of distance. And a lot of that stuff is sort of pulled into the novel that way. It's a difficult thing to do, at least for me, because, I mean, children have very little agency. You don't have a job or a car or a say in what the hell is happening, even at the best of times, and this novel does not take place in the best of times. So what replaces that was really fascinating to me. The ways in which children find avenues of agency, of some control over their surroundings, is something that is infinitely... It was interesting to me before I had kids, and now watching my kids do that. It's just a fascinating way to be human. But on a macro level, it really is. You just have these systems that are fundamentally fraudulent. They depend on a lie about the world, and through that lie create an underclass of human beings that are disposable. And a lot of our systems work this way. I'm pretty sure some of the clothes I'm wearing are a result of a system like that. And because I'm writing about these systems that are vague, and I don't know who the CEOs of the oil companies are or the gun manufacturers. I don't know these people individually. That's part of their protection, is that I don't know them individually. They exist in the system, the cocoon of the system. I try to collide them with something as individual as you can get, which is the life of an individual child. Whether I succeed or fail at any of this is an entirely different story. Whether I do it properly or not is an entirely different story, but that's sort of the intent when I go into the book.
Yeah, I mean, like global gets thrown around a lot these days. Globalization sort of now is kind of in its 20th year officially, like where people say, oh, globalization, the world's flat or whatever. But there are these sort of global themes, right, of climate change, human rights, childhood, things that you find everywhere, right? They're not absent. I mean, maybe it's human rights violations, not human rights, that you find everywhere. And in many ways, you're like a global author. I mean, these various places, and being unanchored is, in a way, a kind of condition of that. And you talked about neoliberalism as the producing sort of environment. So we often think about globalization as being like neoliberalism and globalized. But there's this other side, I think, which is that like being unanchored, is that really a loss, or does that liberate you to write about these things in the ways that you do? Like if you were anchored in Cairo, could you write? Maybe you'd write a different kind. You'd write a different kind of book, obviously, right? Yeah. So I guess like it's a question of like loss. Like what it's like, what's the trade-off? Like we want open borders for people, right? We don't want people to be persecuted on the borders. That's a kind of globalization. At the same time, we don't want toxic stuff crossing borders, right? And dumping our garbage in Africa, and all of that kind of thing. So
Yeah,
you see what I'm getting at?
I think so. I mean, I don't know if you ever meet like one of these the Wall Street bros, the guys who are like the invisible hand.
I can definitely say no.
They like the free market will fix it. The invisible hand, and they're insufferable. I'm that guy, but for the invisible foot. Like I'm very much. That's how I feel about borders. That's how. Yes, if we remove them all tomorrow, it would be chaos, but maybe the day after tomorrow, maybe if we did it like sort of gradually, I'm very much that guy. And that's a response to the kind of life I've had, and I think a lot of people who maybe grew up in one place would have a very valid criticism of what I just said as being incredibly naive or all the rest of it, and that's perfectly fine. It doesn't stop me from believing it, though. I have very little respect for the entity of a nation state, a sort of political entity. Because I come from a part of the world where 100 years ago, a bunch of British and French guys drew some lines on the map, and now we have these constructions that have become a central part of so many people's identities, as they should. You're born in this place, you grow up in this place, of course you're going to have an affinity for this place. But I don't, you pick up American War and you look at the map in the front, and I've drowned the eastern seaboard, and I gave Southwest back to Mexico, and I did all of this stuff. In What Strange Paradise, it's clearly we're on the eastern edge of Crete, but it's never mentioned that, and I've changed the flora and fauna, and I've moved the island around however I want. Again, that's a function of who I am as a person. That said, I carry the negative space of who I am around with me like an anvil, because the earliest stories I heard about literature, which came from my dad, were of the exact opposite of that experience. They were of the Naguib Mahfouzes of the world. where it's like, oh, you were born in this place, you marinated in this place, and you understand it down to its marrow. And you write these photorealistic depictions of what it means to be a mid-20th century Egyptian everyman. And I wish I could do that. For a variety of reasons, some of them deeply irrational, like my dad died 12 years ago. I'm still trying to please what I think he would, what he would think of the writing, and all of that kicks in. Then I can't help but think of who that guy would be if we had just stayed in Egypt, if I had sort of felt ownership of something. But I'm not that guy. And so one of the reasons that these novels I write deeply don't resonate with certain people is because it is the opposite of that experience. If you come up in a place and you have an affinity for that place, and then suddenly I'm superimposing somebody else's wartime experiences on top of it. Like there's a part of American war that takes place in this town called Lincolnton. Nobody's ever heard of Lincolnton. If I were a betting man, I'd say nobody here has been to Lincolnton. Cannot tell me the state that Lincolnton is in. I get so many emails from people in Lincolnton being like, why did you choose our town? Was it this thing? Was it that? And I'm like, well, I chose your town because people have heard of New York City. And I wanted a flat ground to superimpose my story on top of.
But it's also Lincoln.
But it's also Lincoln, which is like the saddest, most obvious sort of like, hey, it's a Civil War book. Let's go to Lincoln.
No, but it's a city, a town.
Oh yeah. But it's sort of like the notion of again, that prism, right? Of like, I'm dragging my experiences into the book. Surely this book was written through the same prism, kind of thing. Which I'm being flippant, and not all readers think of it this way. But I don't. My prism is fractured in that respect. I don't do those kinds of readings. But I wish I did, and I wish I was that kind of writer. And that's going to be the case for the rest of my life. There's no fixing that, right? Even if I live for the rest of my life in one place from here on in, there's that thing about being born into it or growing up into it. I read a research paper recently that the temperature you are accustomed to for the rest of your life, again, this is totally a misreading on my part, I'm sure, but is whatever temperature you grew up in around between the ages of 5 and 8. Whatever that was is like your room temperature from there on in. And mine was like 50 degrees. And, so Canada's just nightmarish existence for me climactically. But I don't have that, right? That was split up. And the writing's going to be like that for the rest of my life.
Yeah. We look forward to the next book, and we'll be the judges. Yeah. Well, we have some time, and I want to open the floor to the audience here to ask Omar questions, and you'll just have to shout it out. And if we can't hear you, I'll repeat it. So does anybody want to start us off? Well, I started us off, so does anyone want to follow up on some? Marwan, right? Okay. Yeah, you got it. Okay, I'm not sure if everybody behind you can hear, but so the question is in What Strange Paradise, the protagonist, the young boy, is he's being smuggled across the Mediterranean from Alexandria to Europe and some unknown destination. And there's another ship there, and the smugglers basically, are using this terrible ship that's barely, viable to transport, and they say they won't use a good ship because. So is that does that come from history or experience as a journalist, or?
Yeah, a little bit. The dialogue is made up, obviously, but it's based on, when I was doing research on this, obviously, I was reading the books about it, but there was also, I hunted down some of the Facebook pages that the smugglers have, and one of the things about those pages, I don't know if this exists or not anymore, but You know, there's like a background image on a Facebook, like at the top, there's that, yeah, and for that page, it was a picture of a Carnival Cruise Lines ship. The impression is very much that like this is going to be a luxury trip, because who cares once you get them on the boat? Like, what are they going to do? Turn around? And so that was the instigating sort of moment for that scene, was this idea that like once you're engaged in this kind of work, there's no ceiling of shame or like, you know, that's blown off. And so why not convince them they're going to be eating lobster and taking a cruise across the Mediterranean and then throw them on the thing? It's incredible cruelty. And again, like in that scene, it's incredible cruelty at a sort of individual level, but this is systemic as well, right? How many of these North African countries get millions of dollars from Europe to basically just stop these folks at all costs? And the way they stop them are brutal. This happens as a systemic level as well. It just happened that that scene was very much based on a very individual experience of seeing how they did this.
That's a good question. Thanks. Yes, please. So the question is, how did he assemble What Strange Paradise? It's divided into kind of 2 times, before and after. And did you write the before part together and then the after part, and then sort of figure it out?
Yeah. So the short answer is no. When I started writing, the only thing I had was the opening paragraph and the closing paragraph. I didn't know much about what was coming in between those 2 things, which is actually similar to American War. I had an opening scene and a closing scene. But in American War, the opening scene has been changed quite a bit, and the closing as well. Anyway, so with What Strange Paradise, I had this opening paragraph and closing paragraph. And the book went through 8 drafts. And around draft number 4, there was something that just wasn't working. Because initially, the book started with that opening, and then just went through the after chapters with a lot of flashback sequences, because I would get to these places where I was like, oh, clearly the reader's not going to understand what the hell's going on unless I explain this little bit of backstory. So the pacing was screwed up. It was just a very jarring, like this, you know, writer's retreat into like star, and then explain something and then start. And it was horrible. Like, it was just very sort of janky that way. And then around draft number 4, it occurred to me that I had this very sort of Old Testament, New Testament back and forth, where I had sections of the book that were very much concerned with a miraculous rebirth, and sections of the book that were concerned with an exodus from Egypt. And I thought, what if I tried to codify this in some way? And that's when before and after showed up. And so once I did that, that made life a lot easier, just on a narrative level. It gave me some technical challenges, but otherwise it made it easier. That was one of the good decisions. There's lots and lots of bad decisions. So at a certain point, I thought it would make a lot of sense to have monologues from each of the people on the boat, like in between the chapters. And so I spent 3 months writing 30,000 words of monologues from each of these people. I got to know them really well as a result. But as soon as I put it into text, I was like, oh, this is not working at all. So that was a detour that didn't work. But that before and after construction, once it came in, I mean, I attach no moral component to this, but it's a deeply manipulative book. It's trying to manipulate the reader emotionally in certain ways. And once you get into that before and after construction, you can do things like tell the reader something that overtly spoils the plot in the opening pages, and then spoil that spoiling by going back and forth. And so there were things that I could do that could manipulate the reader that way in the before and after construction that I couldn't have done in a straightforward narrative. So I got very lucky with that. And once it fell into place, the rest of it was just sort of more straightforward editing. That was the main structural thing that allowed me to continue the book. And it kept getting shorter and shorter after that, because it was becoming much more focused. And I was able to become more focused because I had this structure. It solved the central problem of the book for me.
Thanks for the question. Other questions from the audience, please? Anybody else want to ask Omar about? Yeah. The question is, you've talked about how anchored you feel. Do you feel the need to anchor your children?
Yeah, thank you for that.
So you have 2 kids.
I do. I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old.
Both Americans born in Portland?
They're dual citizens.
Okay.
Yeah. They're our anchor babies. We got our I should say we got our citizenship.
That's a thing, right? That's a thing for immigrant communities. It's like the anchor baby, the one you have so they get citizenship.
It's funny because we're constantly trying to get the hell out.
You got your citizenship through your kids?
Yeah.
Oh, you did. Your kids were U.S. citizens, and then you applied because our kids are U.S. citizens. We should be too.
No. We had gotten our citizenship independently of that because my wife is on that H-1B thing because she's a professor. I would have never gotten citizenship otherwise if it wasn't for my wife, because I showed up on an I visa, which nobody has ever heard of. It's for journalists, and I swear to you, this is how you get an I visa. In my case, you go to Pearson, carrying copies of various Globe and Mail front pages that you are on. They send you to the back, you show them to the officer, who checks your name against the byline. I was like, yeah, I guess. Stamps it with an I visa. There is no discernible path to citizenship from an I visa. I fully just hung on for dear life to my wife's much more competent state of affairs. Yeah, I mean, so to go back to your question, it's I'm a huge coward about this sort of thing. One of the things about my kids is that in the back of my head, I'm constantly thinking like, are they going to pass, right? Are they going to have the same issues that, my mom's a much nicer person than me in every respect. She doesn't have this accent. And generally speaking, across the board in this part of the world, the treatment she gets at everything from a border crossing to a Starbucks is significantly worse than mine. Because there's certain elements in which she doesn't pass. There's certain elements in which the person talking to her doesn't feel like they can exchange the same shorthand, the same cultural shorthand where you don't have to say certain things. And I'm constantly thinking about that in the context of my own children. That's a cowardly thing to do, but also I'm a brown Muslim guy named Omar who's living in this part of the world. And there's a lot of cowardly things I do in that regard. For the longest time when I would go through TSA at the airport, I would be like, yes, sir, no, sir, very. And then I realized that it worked more in my favor if I was like, hey, how's it going? Because that's what the white people in the line are doing, right? And maybe I can pass because of this accent. And maybe if I get that in before they open the passport and see my name, maybe that's a lot of wasted brain power and emotional energy on stuff that shouldn't matter. And so I project that onto my kids who are oblivious to all of this because they weren't born in Egypt and they aren't growing up in Qatar and they didn't come here when they were 16, right? So there's a lot of projection onto them, which is unfair. Mostly I want whatever leads to happiness. There's part of me that's like, yes, you should absolutely be rooted in one place so that you don't have to deal with this nonsense that I'm constantly thinking about. And then there's part of me that's like, you should know your home and all the various lineages you're from, and and those two things are at war at any given moment. And I've had to sort of turn down the volume on all of that and just make it secondary to them being happy. Problem is I have no idea what the hell that is, and which one of those roads is going to lead to that, but at least conceptually, I try to make that the thing, as opposed to the 100 times in a day where I am, like you learn how to answer that whole thing about like, oh, but you speak English so well. It's like, yeah, it's a scavenger language. Anybody can learn this. It's fine. It's not, you learn that stuff, right? I was doing an interview once for a podcast, and the guy was like, he did that thing, but you speak English so well. How? And I thought I'd make a joke. I was like, well, actually, what I do is I write the books in Arabic and then I run them through Google Translate. And he believed me. And immediately it was too awkward to do anything about it. There was no way I was going to go back and be like, hey, 5 minutes ago, that was a joke. So for the rest of that interview, this guy, fortunately, nobody listened to that podcast, so he got away with it. But it's that stuff, right? And I know they're not going to have to deal with that, but there are elements of them, right? They have my name. And that they don't, they're not going to have the accent. I wish I didn't think about all that stuff, but I do constantly, and I'm trying not to make them aware that their dad is doing this, because I think that's a route to messing them up a little bit. So that's my very rambling way of saying I'm not sure.
Maybe in a few years you could move them to Toronto and then to Montreal and then to
Just keep
Doha,
them on their toes, right?
Doha and then Cairo, and just like, okay, this is a trip I made. You're going to make it in reverse.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. We're going to end up in Egypt, and everybody's going to be equally unhappy. That's how we're going to do it.
Yes, please. Oh, that was me. I'm the one with the green card. Yeah, he's a citizen. No, that's mine. That was mine. I was driving him. I could.
You know what's weird about that? No, I don't care what happens to you. Yeah, I don't have to drive back with you, so I'm in the clear. I'm actually driving back through Buffalo. I'm driving into Buffalo and then flying back, so we'll see, I guess. I've had a very odd thing where the more bizarre an explanation I give the officer at the border crossing, the more likely I'm allowed to be let in with no issues. Because when I worked for the Globe, like, there was one time, before you can go to a place like Afghanistan or any war zone coverage, the insurance company won't allow the paper to do that until you do something called hazardous environment training, which is, in our case, was just go down to a farm in Virginia and have some former British Special Forces guys simulate explosions around you and stuff. And so I decided to drive down. And, 3 a.m, this guy shows up at a random border crossing, and the U.S. agent is like, what are you going down for? I'm like, oh, I'm going for war training before I go to Afghanistan. No issues. No problem at all. Because what kind of terrorist in his right mind is going to give that as the explanation for going to the U.S., right? I'm going to Andrews Air Force Base to hop a flight to Gitmo. Again, no issues at all. The last time I was put in secondary and given a hard time was when I was flying into New York, and they asked me what I was doing. I said, I'm going to see my cousin. And that was secondary right away. So yeah, it's been a weird experience. And honestly, like, the only reason I got the U.S. passport is so, like, what are you going to do about it? Yeah, I'm going to see my cousin. What are you going to do about it? I feel like every cultural or ethnic minority has their thing that basically falls under the category of, once I get this, they can't mess with me anymore. And I think for a lot of people in my part of the world, it's the passport, it's the citizenship. And so that was the main reason. That, and, like, there's a couple of grants I can apply for if I'm a U.S. citizen. But yeah, it's been this weird reverse thing where, like, the times where I most expect to get trouble, they're like, there's no way. There's no way that this is a thing. And the times where I give them the most benign explanation, it's like, nope, anybody could have said that. Let's go.
Oh, yeah. I have a Canadian
appreciate
passport.
that.
I'll
Thank
always
you.
be welcome here. That's the only passport I actually have. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. It's a good question. I mean, with both novels, one of the things they have in common is that I could have ended them a few pages earlier, and it's a very different book. I think a lot about this interview I read. I think it was in the Paris Review with James Baldwin many, many years ago, where he was living in France at the time. And the interviewer kept talking about it as this great literary adventure. You're walking in the footsteps of Hemingway and Fitzgerald and this and this. And it's Baldwin trying to explain, like, no, I had to leave the U.S. because they were going to kill me. Like, I couldn't be as angry about America being the human being I am and the skin color I have and not be killed. And so that's why I'm here, not because I want to visit the left bank or whatever, sit on the cafes. And I think of people like Baldwin as doing successfully the thing I'm doing very unsuccessfully, which is that strange alchemy where you take this anger and you turn it into something really, really profound on the page. Because in the end, it's heat, right? And in both my novels, you can see the scorch marks. You can see the places where it got away from me. And I I try my best to control it and move it narratively in a way that doesn't show it for what it is. But it gets away from me left, right, and center. I'm not good enough to do it the way that my heroes do. And I think that's going to be the case across the board. There's certain obligations that I think are sort of imposed from without passively that I don't impose on myself. I get asked about hope a lot, for example, right? Like, where's hope for you? Where's hope in these books? And I was like, the act of writing is hope, right? You assume somebody's on the other side to read this thing. That in of itself is enough. And I don't think of hope as like the obligation to just believe everything's going to work out regardless of what we do. I think of that as delusion. And I make stuff up, but I don't traffic in delusion. That's a distinction I make. So yeah, I mean, I'm not good enough to just write about anything. There are certain authors, like I'll read James Agee's film reviews. I'll go back and read his film reviews. I love his writing so much. I don't care what he really thought about those films. I just love the writing so much. I'm not that guy. I write about what feels most important to me, and that overlaps almost directly with what makes me most angry. And the central challenge for the rest of my life is not to give you a house on fire. You know, to give you a house where the heat has been turned up quite a bit. It's deeply uncomfortable to sit in it, but not the house on fire. And a lot of times in the previous novels and in both the published novels, there's parts of the house that are clearly on fire. That's a failing on my part as a writer. And I'm trying to figure out a way around it, but that's a lifelong sort of learning experience.
We have time for maybe one more question. Yeah, please. With the experience of with publication, with publishers and literary publication, what would have been your experiences?
I won the lottery starting out. So I wrote these 3 novels that were thoroughly unpublished, which is not good, and it's not, so I wasn't going to show them to anybody. Or my poor friend Anna is the only reader of those books. She's my first reader on everything. She's suffered quite a bit in her life. And American War was the 4th one. I wrote all of these while working at the Globe and Mail. I wrote them in my spare time. And American War was done and was just sitting on my hard drive with the other 3. I had no intention of showing it to anybody, or I had no publisher or agent or any of that stuff. And then I had a bad day at work. I had a day where I felt like I was just rewriting press releases, and I was like, listen, is it really going to be 30 more years of this and then a gold watch and, 20,000 stories nobody's ever going to remember? And so I remember I had this really miserable conversation with my managing editor, hung up the phone and said, to hell with this. And I went and emailed a literary agent who I'd met randomly 8 years earlier. And we exchanged like an email a year at Christmas, just like, hey, how you doing? And I said, listen, I know it's every literary agent's worst nightmare when a journalist says, I have a novel for you, but I have a novel for you. Would you mind taking a look? And she agreed, and she read it. And a few days later, she came back and said, I want to send this to Sonny. You should look him up. And so I look him up. It turns out it's Sonny Mehta, who's the head of Knopf. And the way I find out about him is that one of the first things that comes up is this Vanity Fair article explaining how he's the most powerful man in U.S. publishing. And I was like, oh, we're wasting our time. And for 3 months, we hear nothing. And then in the fall of 2015, we just get an email that says, I like it. And then the offer came in. And the offer was for what sounded like a ludicrous amount of money. I didn't know how advances work at the time. I thought they just give you a bag with like a dollar sign on it. That's not how it works. They split it up and the agent takes a cut and then taxes come for you. But it sounded like I was set for years. And the first thing they tell you when that sort of thing happens is don't quit your day job. And the first thing I did was quit my day job. I just burned every bridge at the Globe immediately and ran in the other direction. Because I thought, like, if you can't jump off the cliff and hope there's water at the bottom under these circumstances, you're never going to do it. Like, this is it, right? This is... Sonny edited Toni Morrison. He's the reason The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy exists. By the time we started working together, he'd been in the industry for 40-plus years. I was the least of his concerns. So I had the best of both worlds. I had this incredible editor who... And also, I wasn't important enough to, like, try and turn it into the next Hunger Games or something. So I had this perfect sweet spot. And Knopf is an amazing imprint. Everything was amazing, right? We sold the foreign rights in 13 countries. We earned the advance out, I think, before the book went on sale. Like, just these things that, like, aren't supposed to happen. And then I decided to write What Strange Paradise, and it was like I was deliberately trying to sabotage my own career. because I had this book that like people loved the speculative, or the people who did love it loved the speculative nature of it, the kinetic nature of it, and then I give them this book that's contemporary, way quieter, has none of those elements. The foreign publishers didn't want anything to do with it. Nobody was excited about it, and I knew nobody was excited about it because I'd seen what it looked like when people are excited about your book. You know, my agent would go to New York, and she was walking down the halls of one of the other big publishers, and one of the heads of the other publishing houses was walking and saw her and was like, "Oh, you're representing the book." That's how they were talking about American War. So American War, even though by my standards has done insanely well, is still considered a bit of a disappointment because they were expecting like a massive sort of million seller. There was no enthusiasm for What Strange Paradise, except for my Canadian editor, Jared Bland, who loved it for some reason. And were it not for a really good New York Times review, and obviously what happened with the Giller Prize, I think my career would have been over. There was just no, there was no interest in it. And then midway through the editing process, Sonny passed away. And I was inherited by another editor, Tim, who I didn't think really liked the book, but did an incredible editing job on it, like made it a much, much better book. And then he left the company, and then there was a new editor. And it's just, I started up here, and I'm not sure what the hell is happening anymore. But the publishing side of things, I got very, very lucky. There are writers who are much, much better than me, who aren't getting these kinds of advances, who aren't selling these numbers. And I try to sort of comfort myself by saying that there's writers who are worse than me who are doing much better. So you know, I'm on a continuum. But really, like I got exceptionally lucky to start where I did. And it's not, I think, the default experience of going into this industry.
Well, with that, please, you've been great. It's been a great audience, great questions, and great attention to the answers. So thank you so much for being here. And everybody online, thank you for joining us. And please put your hands together for Omar El Akkad. And so Omar will be around for a little while, and then he's off to Toronto, and he's going to be giving away the Giller tomorrow night. No, Monday night. So thanks again, everyone. If you want to talk to him, he's here. He'll sign your book, and great guy. Have a good afternoon.